We got one more person logging in. We'll let her get in and we'll go. Okay, are you ready? All right. Well, folks, want to thank Rachel Blevins for joining us tonight. She did a program on birding by sight and sound back in the winter, and it was very well received. Heard a lot of good comments about that. And so we invited her to talk about hummingbirds, and she graciously accepted and will be talking to us about hummingbirds this evening. Rachel is the Chief Ranger for Visitor Experience at Natural Tunnel State Park down in Duffield, Virginia, and she's also a member of the High Knob chapter of Virginia Master Naturalist. So, Rachel, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Phil. Let me share my screen real quick, and then we'll get started. All right, can y'all see that on your end?
Yes.
Well, awesome. Thank you guys again. I recognized a few names and faces on the guest list, so thank you all for having me back again to talk about hummingbirds this time. So it's that time of year. I'm not sure if you all have seen any, but we are starting to see quite a few hummingbirds out at Natural Tunnel. I see quite a few at my office. So they're back, and we'll kind of get into that later on as far as the migration goes. But I'll just introduce myself real quick again. Phil kind of covered it, but I'm the Chief Ranger of Visitor Experience over at Natural Tunnel. I started my career with Virginia State Parks at Hungry Mother, and I actually drove down from Michigan 7 years to today, the exact day. So that's kind of how I got started in Virginia State Parks, and I've been at Natural Tunnel for the past about 3.5 years now. And so what we'll do, and I have two of my favorite birds, I'll mention those. The hooded warbler and the Baltimore oriole are two of my favorite birds. But what we'll do today is we will kind of go over, we'll zoom out first and look at hummingbirds as a bird species as a whole. And then we are gonna kind of zoom into hummingbirds that we'll find in our area and kind of look at the adaptations in regards to the species that we have. And then at the end, we can save time for some questions, discussion, stories, whatever. So we'll get right into it. And overall, as far as species go, there are quite a few species of hummingbirds. We have close to 300 species worldwide, which is pretty significant amount. Most of them will probably be in the Central and South Americas. And so just where we get into the southern tropics and the rainforest down there, it just gives way to a boatload of diversity as far as these different hummingbirds go. And then of course, some of these photos of these birds, it's pretty amazing. Not one or not two species really look like the other. There are a few that are a little similar in their coloration, but it's just amazing how truly diverse they are as far as their physical appearance. But here in North America, we have just 23 species. So it's kind of a major drop compared to looking worldwide. We have 23. Most of those migrate, so they're not really here year round, aside from a few of our southern states. And then in Virginia, the hummingbirds make it easy for us. We have one species, and that is our ruby-throated hummingbird. And so that is going to be the species that we're really going to focus on. And I'll try to relate all of what we talk about as far as their adaptations back to the ruby-throated, because that's the one that we're going to be seeing. And I want it to be at least relative to all of us. So our hummingbirds, of course, they are our smallest bird. And so as far as the ruby-throated goes, they're about the size of a penny, or I mean the weight. They would weigh a penny. So if you had some spare change next time you pick up a penny, that's about the size that ruby-throated hummingbird will weigh. So the average comes in at about 3 grams. Not everyone knows how much three grams off the top of their head feels like, but a nickel is 4.5 grams. So if you picked up a nickel, hummingbird would weigh a little bit less than that. And then most of the species that we have in our Western Hemisphere, we have more species of hummingbirds than we do any other or all the breeding birds in Virginia combined. So in Virginia, I believe we have close to 230 breeding species documented in the state of Virginia. And we have entirely way more species of hummingbirds. So this goes right back to that diversity of just this one single bird. But the picture at the bottom with the flower, that is the smallest hummingbird species, and that is the bee hummingbird. And that one weighs, I want to say, about 1.5 grams. So significantly smaller. It's only about 2.5 inches long. So it's much smaller than our ruby-throated, but that is the bee hummingbird. And it also gets the nickname penny hummingbird too. So we'll start out with what we're looking at. So the appearance. Our hummingbird for ruby-throated, we have our female on the left-hand side, and she is pretty, I won't want to say the word drab, because she still has a beautiful coloration. But she has more of that olive green backside, and then the front of her, and you can sort of see her chin, is just a solid white coloration. And then our male, hence the name ruby-throated, he'll have that ruby red throat, and he'll also have the green backside, just like the female. Sometimes it's a little darker in color, but that, of course, is the reasoning behind that. If the female had that bright red color, as she's sitting on her nest to protect those eggs, she would stick out like a sore thumb. And so she gets more of a camouflage color, while the male gets a little bit flashier coloration to attract a female. And I put in here, it's honestly, for me especially, where I like to bird by ear versus trying to spot them. They don't sit still long enough for me. But you can usually hear a hummingbird more often than you'll see it. Usually they just zoom on right by. So I'll play a few of the sounds, and it's pretty distinguishable. So once you hear it, you may notice it in your backyard. So it's kind of a real high-pitched squeak, and then I think one of these has a really good example of that humming sound that they make, which actually is not their vocal, that is their wings making that sound. So those are the sounds that they do make. So it's a real high pitch, kind of repetitive squeak sound. In that last clip, there was a cardinal kind of chiming in there. So disregard that. But that is the sound of it. So if you're ever outside and you hear this high pitched squeak, just keep your eyes open for a quick flying object in the sky, because more than likely it's a hummingbird. But this is something I really wanted to touch on. Because it's really cool, especially in regards to hummers. So the iridescent feathers, of course, I'll go back with both the green and the red coloration. Those are iridescent in the sense that depending on how you look at it or what angle you're looking at the bird, the color almost changes. And a lot of it has to do with the sunlight. And some days on cloudy days, they don't look as shiny or reflective. But it's really interesting. I didn't know this until a few weeks ago, but the reasoning behind these iridescent feathers is it's called a melanosome, and it's a structure that's found within each feather cell. And they did a study. They used an electron microscope, and they looked at a hummingbird feather, and then within one feather, they found over 100 million melanosomes in just one feather, which is pretty amazing. That's quite a bit going on in just one feather, and it kind of just shows why we get that iridescent coloration. And so these melanosomes in hummingbirds are a different shape compared to other birds. So it's more of a pancake flat kind of circular shape, and it's filled with a lot of air bubbles. So when those air bubbles hit the light, it reflects off and it gives that iridescent color. Other birds have these melanosomes in their feathers. They don't have the same multitude of them like the hummingbird, and the shape is a little bit different. It's more like a tube shape, and there's not as much air. So a good example I put in there, the green head and neck of a mallard duck. That's a good one. The other one is a common grackle. Sometimes they look just solid black, and when the sunlight hits them, they kind of give off that purplish hue. So they still have that iridescence, but it's just not as significant as our hummingbird. But this is a good example right here of the shape of the feathers. And of course, just in one of those little circular feathers are over 100 melanosome structures, which is pretty incredible. It's hard to fathom. And if you all have any questions while I'm going over everything, just put it in the chat. I think I can see the chat, but if not, I'm sure Phil will let me know. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about their behavior, because they are, once you kind of get to watch them, they do have a personality to them. It's really fun to watch. But the hummingbird species is the only bird that can truly hover. And I have a few clips I'll show you. It's easier to kind of visualize than me just telling you about it. But they can hover, and then they can also fly backwards. And they're the only bird species that can fly backwards, truly backwards. And reasoning behind that, on their shoulders, they have a unique attachment between the muscles and the bones. It gives them a little bit more flexibility and power, and they can move backwards. And then I put in their wing beats. It's really quite amazing how fast these wings can flap. So when they're hovering, so if you're watching it approach a flower or a feeder and it's just hovering there, those wings are beating about 55 beats per second. So that's it's amazing. And then of course their full speed, they can get up to 75 beats per second. So they can fly up to 25 miles per hour. And that is believable, as you can see them zooming around in the sky. It's amazing. But this is a really cool image. It kind of breaks down the wing flight pattern for different birds and insects. So our hummingbird is in the bottom right. And you look at it, it moves in two different directions, and its wings actually make more of a figure 8 pattern. So it'll move forward, and then it actually switches its wings as it goes backwards, which is really amazing. And the video I'll show you all here in a second really breaks that down. It'll take a minute to load. And so this is an example of a hummingbird hovering. So only a bird species that can just hover and hang out in midair, mid-flight. And then you could really see, I'll back it up a little bit, that figure 8 pattern it makes with its wings. It's amazing how they just can balance their little body like that. And then I have one more. And this one has a really good example, these next few clips, of how it can not only hover, but also move backwards. That's a good example. I can just back right up.
My goodness, look at all the hummingbirds this morning. We counted 8.
All right, so I won't go through all of it, but it just gives you all a good visual of how just how fast those wings are moving, even when their body's not moving. 55 beats per second. Okay, so we will go into migration because all of our hummingbirds do migrate, especially ruby-throated. And so here in Virginia, the arrival date is usually mid-April, and then they will depart later in the fall. But there is a difference. Our males actually have a different migration timing versus our females. And so our males will arrive here in the spring before the females, and then they will head out and make their journey back earlier in the summer. So our male hummingbirds may start to migrate south for the winter as early as August. And that that's something I do notice at our feeder at Natural Tunnel. In the fall, it's typically only females that I do see. But the reasoning behind that is just breeding and feeding competition and establishing their territory. And so those males want to get to their home base in the north or south and get their territory established by the time that the females are there, so they can get ready to nest and go from there. But our ruby-throated hummingbirds make a pretty incredible journey, and so they will come down, and they have 2 different paths that they can take. There's a pink and then there's a purple, and so the pink one is a little bit bigger because that just shows the volume of birds that take that path. And so our ruby-throated hummingbird will actually go and travel across the Gulf of Mexico, which is a pretty daring endeavor, mainly because there isn't anywhere to really rest or stop. You're over a large body of water. So very few species they will actually go up the shoreline route there in Mexico. But our ruby-throated usually will travel, it's about 500 miles. And so they're flying constantly for up to 22 hours, which is, it's amazing. Just the sheer endurance that these birds, and they're so tiny that they can carry out that trip. And there are stories of boaters out on the Gulf, and they'll oftentimes find some of the weaker hummingbirds, and they'll actually rest on their boats, which I thought is kind of interesting. But that is an incredible journey that our ruby-throats make. But they will start their journey in February, so they want to be to the Yucatan Peninsula by February. And so while we hardly are thinking about spring in February, they've got spring on the mind, and they're already heading north towards us. So this is, and I can send this link out in the chat after I'm done, but this is a really cool map. I just took a screenshot of it, but this is a live map of the current migration route for all hummingbird species. So on the bottom there, it's color coded by different species, and so it's pretty obvious that east of the Mississippi, ruby-throat are the only hummingbird species we have. I mentioned earlier that most all of the species in the United States migrate. There's a few spots here in Florida and up the eastern coast where there's a yellow, and that means over the winter or year round. And so there are some populations or groups of ruby-throats that may just hang out just because of the environment down there where it is so much warmer. But this is as of yesterday. I tried to take the most recent shot, but this is what we have going on as a whole in the entire United States right now, as far as where all the different species are at. So it seems like our ruby throats have even made it upwards into Canada by now. So I know my parents, they live up in Michigan, and the hummingbirds arrived at their house a few weeks ago. And so I zoomed in on our area just to see what it looked like. And I just clicked on one of the little birds that was closest to where I'm at. And this was in Coburn, Virginia, and it was documented on April 13th of this year. So that was when they first, whoever did record this. So April 13th, and then I think there was one in Pennington Gap, and that was on April 9th. And so by early to mid-April, we start to see them here in our area. But it's a really cool site to check out. And you can actually add in your own observations too. So it's citizen science, and you can track it in real time. So we'll go into nesting, because that is kind of what is happening for our hummingbirds right now. If you ever come across a hummingbird nest in your lifetime, it's go and buy a lottery ticket. They're really hard to find. I've seen one once, and it was only through a spotting scope. We were doing a birding festival, and we had set up a spotting scope, and we found it accidentally. I think we were looking at another bird, and we saw a clump of what we thought was lichen, and it ended up being a hummingbird's nest. So it's pretty cool. So they are, as far as the shape of the nest, it's a cup shape for obvious reasons, but it's very tiny. Just in reference, you think about a walnut shell, it's about the same size of a walnut shell. So not very big. And then on the inside, they'll take plant material, wrap it up, and start to form the shape of the nest. And then they'll decorate the outside of it with moss and lichen to help really camouflage it. And it really truly does look like there's just lichen or moss naturally growing on the tree limb. So it works pretty well. And then they will collect the spiderweb silk from webs, and that's how they will kind of tie it, and it's essentially like their version of a super glue or duct tape. And they'll wrap it up, and that's how it gets its nice cup shape. And then they are ready to lay eggs. And so she will lay 2 eggs. They're about the size of jelly beans. And in about 2 weeks, they're ready to hatch. And they hang out with mom for only 20 days. And then they are ready to fly and live out on their own. Some bird species co-parent. So the male and the female will help build the nest together and take turns feeding. As far as the hummingbirds go, the female is the one that will build the nest and take care of the young. So the males do their thing, and then they're off on their next adventure. But this is a really good comparison shot. So he's holding a quarter in his hand, and that's about roughly the size of the nest. So it's pretty incredible. The nest we found, it looks so delicate in this photo, but the one we found was pretty sturdy, and it's really on there with that spider web, that webbing. It's really stuck onto the nest. So it's pretty amazing how they can construct it with just their beak. So this is a video of a female hummingbird building her nest. And it's just really cool to watch.
Female Anna's hummingbird plays the roles of surveyor, architect, and builder. She begins her nest with a platform of soft, fluffy fibers plucked from nearby plants. She's chosen a small tree branch that offers a bit of scaffolding to anchor her construction. Working in a circle, she uses her own small frame to shape the cup. Now she she needs a special thread to tie it all together. It's made by another skillful architect, and fortunately, she can find it almost anywhere. Spider silk. As the nest grows around her, she works the inside of the bowl with her feet, compressing the resilient fibers into a thick wall. With her needlework and footwork almost done, she begins to shingle the outside wall with lichen, seeds, and moss. And suddenly, it's perfect. A finished little home for the tiny hummingbirds to come.
It's just pretty amazing how much work goes into building that nest. But their beak is almost ideal for it. It's kind of like a knitting needle in a way, and it's really perfect for kind of weaving all that plant material. But absolutely amazing to watch that. But we'll go into feeding, because that is a major part of a hummingbird's life. They use so much energy flying and building a nest. Of course, migration is also a big thing. So they need energy. And so there's two things on a hummingbird. We have our beak or our bill, and that is what they will use to not only to build the nest like we just saw, but it's also to catch insects and spiders, and they will eat bugs for extra protein. And then they actually have, like this little guy is showing us down at the bottom, they have a tongue, and that's what will actually, when they fly up to a flower or a hummingbird feeder, that is what they will use to drink from. And so they don't actually drink from their beak, but they do have a tubular tongue, almost like a straw. And that's what they use to get that nectar, that liquid out with. But just to put it into perspective, hummingbirds eat a lot in one day. So they would, compared to humans, it would be equivalent to about 50 to 60 full course meals. And so they definitely earn it. They are busy nonstop. And just the amount of energy they put into not only their flying, but their heart rate. Their heart works pretty hard. So their heartbeat can do almost 1,250 beats per minute, which is very dangerous for a human heart. But they consume almost half their body weight each day in sugar. And so they require a lot, but they also eat a lot in return. So they are powerful little birds. And this is at the bottom of the screen. This is a female feeding her young. And it's gross, but it is nature, and not everything in nature is cute. But she will actually, when she catches her food, she will feed it to her young. She'll actually regurgitate it. So it's just a softer way for these young to eat. So not the loveliest fact, but that is how their young will get their food. So she'll catch the bugs, and then she'll partially digest and then regurgitate it to them. And that's what she's doing right there in that little. And so I think this is the last video I have. But this is a really cool one, just showing you all up close how the tubular tongue works. So it's pretty amazing. So they'll take their tongue and it's just what it looks like up close and in slow motion like that, and how it'll just grab that nectar out of there is pretty cool. And that was also another good example of that iridescent coloration on those feathers, just where they had it in slow motion like that. But the cameras are phenomenal. But the last thing I wanted to cover, and this is something that is equally important not only for bird watching but also for our native landscape. But as far as attracting hummingbirds to your backyard, if you have a feeder or the proper flowers, they will come and visit. So their favorite color is red. That is why the hummingbird feeder is red, and of course the hummingbird dye is also red. But the homemade hummingbird feed, this is what I do at the park. I will do 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. And all you do is boil that, let the sugar dissolve, and then you can fill it into your feeder, and just make sure you refill it every couple of days. Usually I have some really spoiled hummingbirds at the office. They go through it in 3 to 4 days anyhow. But just so it doesn't get that bacterial growth in it. And then we always clean our feeder about once a week, just so, again, that mold and bacteria doesn't build up within each different straw. But you do not need to get the artificial red dye. It's not necessary. They are pretty smart birds. They know it's there. And it might take them a day, but once they know it's there, they'll be back. Trust me. And then our native plants, these are some that I just thought of off the top of my head. These are all red or orange in color, but bee balm, butterfly weed, jewelweed, cardinal flower, trumpet vine's a good one, and columbine. Those are all, not only are they a red or an orange color, but they have a tube-shaped flower. That way their tongue can get in and get that nectar out. So those are some plants that are, not only are they good for our hummingbirds, but they're really good for butterflies and other insects too. And they're all native. So we're helping keep our landscape native at the same time. But I will say the hummingbirds that I have at my office, I'll tell a story real quick. I do think the same ones come back to Natural Tunnel every year. And it has been proven that birds will migrate back to the same spot. But about 3 weeks ago, I was sitting at my office at the park, and I was working on some emails or something, and I just had this feeling something was watching me. And so I looked out my front office window, and there is a hummingbird just hovering right in front of my window, looking at me like, where's my hummingbird feed at? So I didn't have the feeder out. So I made sure we got it ready the next day for him. But they're pretty fun to watch. They can get pretty territorial, especially the males. They actually will do kind of like a J-shaped flight pattern for females to impress them. It's more like a J shape or like a pendulum shape, and that's what they do to impress the lady hummingbirds. But the females can get pretty territorial at feeders, and that's where you'll hear some of those high-pitched squeaks. But that is all I had. Did we have any questions?
Yes, there's a question from Erin. She asked, can hummingbirds be too dependent upon feeders?
That is a good question. I don't think they can. And the only reason I'm saying that is because they make that journey. They travel 500 plus miles twice a year. And so if they were truly dependent on feeders, I don't know if they would ever leave. So they are instinctually built to constantly look for a food source, but they are always migrating to get to that food source too. But I do think it's a good mix to have both the flowers and the feeder available too. So hopefully that answers your question, Erin.
And you had a question, what do you do if bees are hanging out around the feeder?
Yeah, we get a lot of wasps around ours. What we'll do is once the feeder or the nectar, the sugar water is gone, We'll clean it really good. Sometimes it gets really sticky on the outside. And that's what initially attracts the wasps or the bees. But as long as that sugar water stays in the feeder, the only thing that can really access it would be the hummingbird with their beak. So that's what we do, and it usually works. But sometimes that water it drips out, and that's when we get a bee problem.
If there are any other questions for Rachel, you can unmute yourself or just type it into the chat. Oh, here's one. I don't know if you're seeing those now, Rachel, but
I
okay.
am now. What is the average lifespan of a hummingbird? I don't know the average, Chris and Paxton, but I do know the oldest ruby-throated hummingbird. She lived to be 9 years and 1 month old. And that was from a bird banding project in West Virginia. So 9 years is a pretty good run for a tiny little bird. So I would say the average, I don't want to give a for sure number, but I would say the average would be between 5 and 7 years old. But the oldest known one to live was over 9 years.
I had a question. You showed the map and was referring to the earliest appearance of the hummingbirds. Is that a particular app? I missed that. Was that something that folks can do, just record and post when they see their first hummingbird somewhere?
I believe so, and I'll send you the link. But it's a website, and I'm not sure if they have an app. But when I went onto it, it had an option where you could record or add your own entry in there. So it sounds like anyone can contribute, and it sounds like there are plenty of contributions. The whole East Coast was covered up in red. So Sheila asked if the same birds return to the feeders each year. Not most birds, but some bird species do come back to the same area. It may not be your house, but they may be in the same neighborhood or ballpark. I had mentioned one that showed up at my office and just stared at me in my window. I think he was one from last summer because he remembered that our feeder was there. So hopefully that answers your question, Sheila. And then Chris and Paxton asked, what are their natural enemies? So that's a good one. Forgot to mention it in one of the earlier videos. They had a slow motion between a hummingbird and a praying mantis. So one of their predators is a praying mantis. They will hang out on feeders or they'll hang out on plants, and they can, if they are quick enough, they can catch a hummingbird. So that is one thing that is a threat to hummingbirds. Another one would be when they're collecting the spider web, they can sometimes get caught up in it. And then depending on the spider species, they can succumb to that too. But another big one is also windows for houses, screen doors. So just putting that reflective tape up. Birds and windows don't do well, and hummingbirds are part of that group too. And how often should you change your feeders? So once you add your sugar water in your feeder, I usually have it last about 2 to 3 days. Usually they'll drink it all before then, but keep an eye on the clearness of it. So if it starts to look gray or cloudy, that's a sign that there might be some bacterial growth in there. And of course, in the summertime when it gets really hot, that sugar water is closed off and it can start to ferment, and it turns into a really toxic alcohol for the hummers. So every 2 to 3 days, and then clean the feeder at least once a week. I've not thought about putting ice cubes in the feeder. I guess maybe birds think it's hot out too. That's funny. But I think it might dilute it a little bit more, but no, that's funny. Didn't think about that. And what's the best recipe for feeders? So it is 1 part sugar, and you can just use table sugar from the store. So 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. So you could do 1 cup water and 1/4 cup sugar. And you can just boil it until everything's dissolved and then let it cool off before you pour it into your feeder. Alan asked, what do you clean the feeders with? Dish soap? Yeah, dish soap is fine. That's what I use. Just make sure you get all the soapiness out of the actual feeder part. But that's what I use. These are all good questions.
Rachel, I read something recently, talked about if you use honey or anything like that. I don't know if this was factual or not, but if you use honey in the feeder or something besides just sugar, that there can be a fungal issue that that the hummingbirds get. Do you know anything about that? Is that true, or is it just something I saw on Facebook?
Well, if it's on Facebook, it's got to be true, right?
Absolutely.
No, I'm kidding. No, that is true. Just because honey does carry more of a fungal or bacterial growth. So the best thing to do is just simply sugar. Honey can really, it doesn't benefit, and it actually can make things worse. But yeah, I've read that too, so that is correct. Just regular cane sugar you can buy in Food City, Walmart. How many, and Sheila asked, how many types of species are there, and how can you tell males from females? So overall, Sheila, there's 300 species total worldwide. So here in North America, we have 23 species, and here in Virginia, we have just 1 species, and that's the ruby-throated hummingbird. But I won't speak on all species because I don't know all 300, but 9 times out of 10, when it comes to distinguishing a male from a female, the male is always going to be more colored. It'll have those colorful colors on it. It may have more iridescence to it, while the female will have a little bit more of a drab or duller look to it. And that is so it can camouflage itself while it's laying on the nest with the eggs in it.
And if anybody would like to watch this again, that will be posted on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So if you missed a part of it or you just want to listen to it again, just email me and tell me that you want that link, and I'll send that to you as soon as it's posted.
Oh, one more question. I've done that too. Sometimes I make too big of a batch of sugar water, and I'll just get an airtight container and store the other half in it so I don't have to remake it or it doesn't go to waste. But that's what I do. But I usually let it come to more of like a room temperature before I set it outside. And then Sheila asked, obviously the hummingbirds prefer her neighbor's yard over hers. Sometimes hummingbirds, I mean, we can't make them come to our yard, but really what it boils down to is the landscape of your yard. So what types of flowers do you have? It sounds like you have some feeder, or you have put feeders out, or you will, but just look at, and I can send a list out too of some native plants, but just some of those native plants like bee balm, cardinal flower, butterfly weed's another good one. So the red and orange tubular shaped flowers that are native, those are what will really attract the butterflies, or not butterflies, hummingbirds to your yard. But you will get butterflies too and other insects. But as I mentioned earlier, the hummingbirds do prey on other insects too. So having those native flowers in your yard will make those hummingbirds visit, not only for the nectar, but for some extra protein as far as bugs go. Well, thank you all. And if you have any other questions, my email is at the bottom, so you can just shoot me an email. I'm not a hummingbird expert, but I will do my best to answer your question.
That was great. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
And on Thursday, I think we have coming up garden diseases. Marianne Hansen from the Plant Disease Clinic at Virginia Tech. We'll be talking about some common diseases that you may see in your gardens. And I think we just have 2 more mountain zooms left, don't we, Jeremy and Shad? We're going to take a hiatus for the summer and then maybe pick back up in September.
I think you're right.
So any closing comments from Shad or Jeremy?
Yeah, great job, Rachel. Thanks so much for joining us again. Great information, great timely information about hummingbirds. Awesome stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hope you all think of a few things when you see a hummingbird next time. Hopefully you get a few in your yard. So.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and hope you have a good evening.